You're lying. Thank you. So thank you for being here tonight. Tithe, for some ministers, is like a 4-letter word, except it's 5 letters. Not for me. So I was thrilled at the annual meeting when this became like a thing, and they were going to have tonight. So what I'm going to do is share with you quickly tonight the research that I went through for myself, because the majority of my life I was not a tither. For me, it seemed like a scheme to get my money by the church. And I was like, yeah, I'm not buying into that at all. And then I began to tithe, and I did really well financially, and then I stopped tithing, and then I lost it all. So I was like, wow, something was going on here. I wasn't sure it was even a correlation, but 6 years ago, it all changed for Jacqueline and I, and I'm going to share it today just simply from where my perspective is. I look at this subject like any other spiritual practice. It's what you have to decide what's right with source within you, okay? But I'm going to take you quickly through that, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A, because part of what we want to do tonight is decide what we do here going into 2020. So I titled today, Tithing versus Giving. And I've said this before to you, that words for me are really important, because they give us a common language and a common understanding. And when we have conversations, so it helps clear up a lot of confusion, I think. So where I started, where I always start in my spiritual journey, is I go first to the Bible. I want to find out what it said in the very beginning about tithing. Does anybody know where the first tithe was? Who was the first tither?
Joseph?
Joseph? No. I don't know whether they did. I never found if they tithed or not, but they could have been.
Didn't it begin with the Levites?
Here's who I found was Abraham. And Abraham tithed to Melchisedec. Now, some of you know who that is. Melchisedec, according to the Bible, says never had a father or mother. So I believe it was the Bible's way of saying that this man was a holy man. He was very spiritual, obviously. But remember, the Hebrews were what? Most of their lives up until now. They were slaves. They had nothing. They were slaves in Egypt to the Pharaoh. And when they were finally got out and got into their freedom, one of the first things that Abraham did was he gave Melchisedec a tithe of all, it says. That's the first place in the Bible that I know where it's in Genesis, very early in Genesis. The next place that it shows up is Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Now you all remember Jacob and the ladder, right? That story when you were kids, if you had Sunday school that you went to. But what's interesting about Jacob is he said and wrote basically a financial covenant with God. And he said, of all that you will give me, I surely will give a tenth back. So that's the second place that I found, and you're going to hear tithe and tenth are the same thing back and forth. And finally, Moses, and later on in Leviticus, said this, the tenth or the tithe shall be holy unto Jehovah. So there's absolutely no doubt that this was taught and became part of the Hebrew society, part of their religion. When I began to study this, I started to track what had happened with the whole Hebrew Jewish faith and the people. And it's very interesting because today in 2020, they basically own all the financial institutes around the world. So I said, there's something interesting here. Because this is a people a society, and a religion that the minute you are born, you're taught to give back the first tenth or a tithe. Eric Butterworth in Spiritual Economics says this, which was new to me. However, the tithe that I'm talking about in the Bible was not the beginning of tithing. Tithing goes way back to ancient world. And he found evidence of it in Babylonia, Persia, Egypt, Rome, and even China. So this was a practice that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. Long before we're talking about it here in Unity. So what else did I learn from my journey through the Bible? The purpose of tithing is to teach always to basically put God first. Malachi was a prophet. The people were sick and impoverished and just having all kinds of problems. And the prophet was told this, and he wrote it down. He said, bring the whole tithe, again 10%, into the storehouse that there may be food in that house, substance, energy in that house. Test me on this. It's the only place in the entire Bible I can find that we're said to test. And this was very important to me 6-7 years ago when I began to do this study. It's like, you know what? If they put out a test, I'm going to take it on. And that's how I approached it. It was, I'm going to test you. All right, you said test me? I will. Test me on this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing you can't catch it all. Test me. Try it, is what I read here. And I thought, well, there's a reason why we're given that challenge to test, to try it out. Now, this is the one that most people want to skip over and pretend that it's not there. Because later on, Malachi, the people were not doing well. And they said, will a man or woman rob God? And they said, how are we robbing you, God? And he said, by not bringing in your tithes and offerings. So no matter where I went in the Old Testament, I was reading it over and over again that this is a thing. And it's a thing that was really important to a lot of people for thousands upon thousands of years. Now, as I told you, most of my life I was not a tither. But as I began to study this and take it inside my heart and ask for guidance and feel it, it began to feel like something that I needed to pay attention to. Now, here's what happens when you flip to the New Testament. People say, well, Jesus never talked about tithing, so that's an Old Testament thing and we don't need to do it today. I don't believe that in a minute, because he was a Jewish rabbi, right? Trained at 12 years old. He could argue with the Pharisees in the temple. It was just what they did. It was part of their lives. So there was no need for him to even discuss it at that point, is my take. But he did talk about your vibe. And he did start talking about giving. And in the New Testament, this is what he said. It's about having a cheerful heart when you give. So here's where the word giving and tithe begin to change. But for me, it's really clear, a tithe means 1/10. So if you use that word, you're saying I'm giving 1/10. Where giving is open for whatever you feel in your consciousness is right to do. And I'm not saying either one's right or wrong. I can just tell you what I've learned and what worked for me and Jacqueline. But I think this is really important to understand the vibe or the consciousness. If you're coming with your tithe as though it's a law or it's a must-do, then I would say probably keep your money in your pocket. Because you're out of alignment with your vibe. You're out of alignment with consciousness, your energy, in what we're being told that you would bring that forward into the storehouse. This is where he talks about, and this again in the New Testament, whatever we give comes back. Another way of saying it comes back even greater than what we give out. It's meted out. It's measured upon the way we give. And to me, again, this goes back to our vibe or our consciousness and our energy. Where are you giving from is much more important than the percentage. You can give 10% and have a consciousness, a vibe that's not cheerful, or it's not something that you want to do out of love or of givingness of your heart. I would tell you to stop. Put it back in your pocket until you come from a place of where your consciousness and your vibe works, and it's something that you do joyfully. So what does unity teach about this? The place I would tell you to go if you were interested is go to Charles Fillmore's Prosperity. And I'm going to show you how you can do that for free. I've taken a couple quotes out of there. Charles said this about a tithe. It's a 10th part of the Old Testament teaching of a tenth or a tithe as a reasonable and just return to God by way acknowledge him or her as your source. That was Charles's take. He went on to say, giving a tenth of one's supply back to God in the work, it's an agreement that we make back to source. He saw it as almost part of the covenant like Jacob did. And this leads us to confidence and assurance because of the increase that comes around it. I know there's a lot of words here. You know Charles had a lot of words. But I pulled this out of his whole chapter. Tithing, which is based on a law that cannot fail, establishes a method for you and I to give, and it brings into our consciousness a sense of divine order. Order. What does order do for us? It builds a confidence. It builds an assurance. It builds a knowingness that our outer life and affairs are increased efficiently and greater prosperity. If you want to read this for yourself, I'm going to show you how to do it for free. It's chapter 9 of Prosperity. The title of the chapter is Tithing, the Road to Prosperity. And if you go to truthunity.net, and up there over the top it says Bible, pull down the Bible and you go right into the book Prosperity. You go right to chapter 9 and you can read the entire chapter for yourself. It's fully loaded, but it's the basis that Charles and Myrtle built Unity on, is this chapter when it comes to money and finances. And when they started Unity, they were broke. Charles went bankrupt 3 times. So he started to apply these principles, and that's what you saw, what now we see the village and everything else that's going on around the world. So I would really welcome you. You have no excuse. It's free. But dig into just this chapter, and you really get the essence of what Charles taught 100-some years ago. So what about some Unity teachers? I took some of the more popular prosperity teachers over the years. The first one is Catherine Ponder. I would imagine most of you in Unity have been around for a while, have read. This is probably the most popular book, The Dynamic Laws of Prosperity. There's a very interesting note about this book. This was the first book she wrote as a prosperity Unity teacher, and the editor told her, you cannot print tithing in your first book. It will be an absolute disaster. And she succumbed to the editor, took tithing out of the first edition, and said later on, she said, I never took tithing out of another one of my books. And the first edition of this didn't do very well, as you could imagine. So she went back and redid it in the second edition and put tithing back in. And again, if you don't want to read the whole book, it's pretty thick. It's a phenomenal book, though. She talks about all the millionaires that came out of the Old Testament, of the folks that I was just showing you. As they applied tithing to their lives, they became the first millionaires way back 6,000 years ago. She calls it this: tithing is an ancient law of prosperity. 10 is the mystical number of increase. So Catherine Ponder was very much into the mystical, metaphysical symbolisms of numbers. And number 10 is equivalent to increase. So no doubt that when she did addition number 2, she put it in chapter 10. So you can't miss that one if you want. It's a wonderful read. It's one of those that I go back to every once in a while. I've probably read it 4 or 5 times through. But her number of books that she has, and as far as I know, she's still living in Palm Desert out in California somewhere, and has been retired for many years now. The other one is Edwin Gaines. We've talked about that. We did some of that study here. Here's what Edwin says: a tithe means a tenth. Now here's something I want you to make note of. She defines it as giving it to a person, place, institution from which you receive spiritual food. That is nowhere, no how is that in the Bible, that you tithe to where you're spiritually fed. That's Edwin Gaines' take on it. And I find it really interesting, when Edwin Gaines was a Unity minister in Tennessee, it was to tithe to the church. Later on, as she had a retreat, it's now to where you're spiritually fed, and yes, you could tithe to me. It became very common in Unity in the last 20, 30 years of all the tithing programs and prosperity programs that were sold in the millions of dollars around, and this became a common theme. Tithe back to where you're spiritually fed meant tithe back to the author of the book or of the program. That is not what it said. It says bring it to the storehouse so that there's substance, there's energy, there's food. She went on, was asked a question in this, and I wanted to bring this up because the way she handles this, I don't agree with either. Now, I'm a certified Edwin Gaines abundance prosperity teacher from 25 years ago. I don't tithe to Edwin Gaines. Maybe that's why she won't talk to me. I don't know. Just saying. But in here she says, what about, is it a tithe if you do 1 or 5%? And her answer I don't agree with, because she says this: since the word tithe means 10%, anything less than that tithe is not a tithe and does not fulfill the law. That is not what I do when I coach someone on tithing. I coach them to systematically begin to give. Whether you call it a tithe or not, but I said do it on a percentage basis. If it's 1%, know that it's 1%, and give that 1%. Because if you know it is, what's going to happen to you, you're going to start to grow and say, oh my goodness, you know what? I could give 3% and 5%, and next thing you're at the 10%. So I don't get hung up on the percentage there. It's more about what's going on in your heart and your consciousness and your vibe. And before I finish here in the next couple of minutes, I'll tell you what my take on it. So Eric Butterworth, you know I'm a great fan of Eric's. This chapter to me is his most convoluted chapter he's ever written on tithing. And I know what he's searching for, and I know what he's trying to do here, but when you read through this chapter, it gets very, very confusing. But the first thing he says is this: at the very outset, let us establish the point that tithing is an excellent practice, and we strongly recommend it. But then he switches from that to, well, let's move away from tithing and we'll start to call it giving. And he kind of moved from the Old Testament into the New Testament, and then it's like, well, what do you want to do here, Eric? And if you read through the whole chapter, but here's where he ended. And if you go to the very back of this chapter, I thought this was interesting. He said, look, let's look at tithing like training wheels. It's the starting place. And as you build a consciousness of giving, don't get hung up on the 10%, let it grow. And he actually had people in his church in New York City who were tithing at 50%. So he got there, but he got there in a kind of convoluted way that he kind of got caught in this whole tithing, giving, whatever. But this was at the very back of that chapter. He says, let's look at it at training wheels. It's a way to get started systematically and let it grow. And you're going to grow out of the abundance and prosperity that happens in your life. So I had to throw this in, because this was part of my research. Who in America tithes? That was my next question. How about these folks? Colgate, Heinz, Kraft, John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller, as a little kid, started to work, and he started to tithe 10%. at the very first paycheck he ever got. It was like 4 pennies. And he continued and continued until at the end of his life he was tithing 50%. Bill and Melinda Gates, they're worth $60 billion. They tithe 50% of their income every year. And they can't give it away fast enough. So there's a spiritual aspect, but there's another law here. That when it comes to money, and you know, there's programs out here in Unity, we say, well, you can tithe your time. And I say, yeah, and you're going to get more time. Well, you can tithe your talents. Well, you'll get more talents. And we've had in Unity so many ways that we tried to wiggle our way around it instead of dealing with it, but the law is the law and it works. But you got to figure that out for yourself. So what do I say about it? First and foremost, it's about your consciousness, your vibe, your energy. When I learned that tithing for me was a way to honor Source in a physical way, everything began to change for me and Jacqueline. Because we started tithing 6 years ago. We had an incredible amount of credit card debt after spending $30,000 some to go to Unity and become a minister and travel back and forth to Detroit and the village. And we started when we couldn't afford it. Period. We just couldn't. But we both looked at each other and said, we're going to have it. There's an argument whether you tithe on gross or net. Here's my take. It says tithe on the harvest. To me, that's net. It's what comes into my house, into my home. I tithe on that. But I tithe on no matter how it comes. Birthday gift, tithe. Increase in my stock account, and I pull money out, I tithe. Anytime there's income coming into our home, we tithe 10% on right off the top. This whole thing about gross, you're going to read that in Catherine Ponder's and Edwin Gaines. To me, that's a bit of a con job again, because they're like, well, if you tithe on the gross, you'll even get more money. And I'm like, no, that just doesn't cut it for me. When the Bible talked about tithing on the harvest, it's what you harvested. You know, what the bugs ate and the floods killed your seed, and here's what you ended up in the harvest, that's what you tithe on. For me, when my taxes come out, that's like bugs eating that part of my... So I'm going to tithe on what comes in. Make it simple. Why? And you know, I don't know why God chose 10. Maybe Catherine's right, it's increase. I think it's to make it easy on the numbers. He knew some of us will be challenged with numbers. All you have to do is move the decimal. I got $526.84 came in this week. Okay, I got a tithe, $52.86. Very simple. Move the decimal one place, and you got 10%. This point is really important. I heard this at the annual meeting. I cringed so much inside when I heard someone say, well, it's our money. No, it's not. It's all God's money, number one. And number two is when you give it in a tithe, you give up any right to it. You have no right to it at that moment. You give it up, release it. That's my third one. Number four, tithing is about God, it's not about me. It's a way for me to show honor and respect for what I believe is true. And number five, it's about my level of trust, faith, confidence in God, the honest truth that's being true for me. So we've been talking here at Unity for like 5 or 6 months about love in action, and we started to do it. We saw what happened Thanksgiving. We're doing, thanks to Carol and her hard work, we're doing it at Christmas. Because love only works if it's in action. So here's my bottom line on tithing. Oh, I got one more I forgot. There's nowhere in there it talks about the temple tithing. Anywhere. I challenge anyone to find it. It says bring it into the storehouse. Now, can a church tithe? Of course. But it's not part of what's given in the law. And the second thing, I don't believe that you tithe where you're spiritually fed. Because here's the confusion, and I don't like this whole concept at all. Being spiritually fed means someone out there fed me, external. I get fed internally from the I am or the Christ within me. And that's the acknowledgement of the tithe, is of that's within me. The Christ, the I am, the source. It's my take. I've found it has worked tremendously. And the last piece is this. Tithing to me is my trust in action. It's my faith works. Remember, faith without works is dead. For me, tithing is the works to bring my faith, my confidence, my trust that God is my source, is my substance, and my supply. When we started 6 years ago, Jacqueline and I said we had an enormous amount of credit card debt. And so I put this plan in action, and this is part of the Holy Money financial plan that I teach, but I just want to show it since you were here today. And this is what we did. The first 10% immediately goes to God, it's the tithe. The second 10% goes to pay off debt. And the third 10% goes to build our investments. And then we party on the 70%. And you know what? We have no anxieties. No concern about money at all. And it's like, well, do we want to buy that? Yeah, we got the money, let's do it. But if you get yourself a systematic order, you can bring a structure to finances and money that allows you to be without any anxiety over it whatsoever. And in 6 years, we've gone from all that debt to zero debt, to buying a house. Now we're paying it off early. Zero debt. And this last year, our net worth went up in a percentage basis more than it's ever done in my life. Is it because we tithe? No, I don't. It's because we had the consciousness to say, I know who my source is. I know who my substance and supply is. And I'm going to honor that with the 10%. And I don't give it to where I'm spiritually fed. I give it to what matters to me, what has value. And for me, having a truth spiritual center in central part of Pennsylvania is what we value right now. And that's what, so I don't tithe to Unity of Harrisburg. I tithe back to that God within me, Spirit within me, the I am within me. That's the way I show honor. It's how I put money where my mouth is. And last, Moses said this, thou shalt always remember Jehovah thy God. He's the one that gives you the power for wealth. When you go back and look at the tithers I showed you, every one of them started when they were young people. And they began to build, and as soon as they could go to 20% and 30%, up to 50%, and you watch what happens around finances, it works. I don't know how else to tell you. But you got to find it in your consciousness what's right for you. If you don't have the consciousness for it, if you don't have that cheerful heart, I mean, I can tell you right now one thing for sure. You can't mess with Jacqueline and my tithe. There ain't nobody going to take that from us. Because we've seen in 6 years what happens. And that's the first thing that comes off the check, and we do it gleefully because we know the blessings keep coming. And keep coming in places we have no idea we're going to come. In channels that we didn't even know. So that's all I have to say, about now who I am and what I believe about tithing. As you can tell, it's not a word I run away from. It's a word I embrace. I love it. And I will, like I said, no one could ever take that spiritual practice away. So I want to turn it over now. We have Q&A because this whole thing is about what are we going to do at Unity of Harrisburg going into 2020. So anyone have anything they'd like to say or get started with the conversation? Nancy, let's cut that off now because I wanted this to be private, whatever anybody has to say.